Forsaken is a 2015 Western starring Kiefer Sutherland and Donald Sutherland. It was written by Brad Merman and directed by John Cassar. When gunfighter John Henry Clayton returns to his hometown to reconcile with his estranged father, he winds up in the middle of a conflict brewing between a group of homesteaders and a greedy land baron. Forsaken is the type of film that I appreciate so much. In a world where Westerns are relatively scarce, it becomes very important that when some name actors decide to sign on for one, that it turns out at least good, if not great. There are still Westerns being made, but for the most part they are very low-budget affairs, and most feature actors that typical audiences would be hard-pressed to name. So the genre is alive, but not nearly as prolific. I remember hearing about this movie back when it was being filmed, and when I learned that Kiefer Sutherland was going to star in a Western, I was pretty thrilled. I am a fan of 24 and of Kiefer Sutherland in it, so it was fairly exciting. Just a note, I have seen this movie once before. I did not wait 7 years to finally take in this movie that I was anticipating so much. But besides just him in the starring role, the main point of interest that sets this movie apart is the chance to see Kiefer and his father, Donald Sutherland, starring together on screen. They had both appeared in a couple of the same movies previously, but had never acted together. So just based on the treat of seeing them in the same film, playing father and son, the movie is wonderful. I think you can tell that both men are really bringing everything they have to the film. Each of them have appeared in hit-and-miss movies over the years. Donald Sutherland's output is pretty unbelievable, especially for his age, but that results in him showing up in not great material sometimes. And Kiefer, for his part, while I find his Boris Karloff impression in Pompeii very entertaining, it's not really what I'd call a great role for him. So when you see them really passionate about a film, it's special. I think every actor secretly or not so secretly wishes to make a Western someday. And while Kiefer and Donald have each appeared in a few over the years, I'm going to say this is the best of the bunch for either of them. Kiefer Sutherland plays John Henry Clayton, the gunman that has put away the tools of his trade and is attempting to live a peaceful life after a tragic event recently. And it is a character that every Western fan has seen before in one way or another. A gunslinger returning home to a town full of people who no longer trust him is pretty standard stuff. John Wayne did it in The Sons of Katie Elder as one example, or a man hanging up his guns and having to try to suppress his violent instincts like Glenn Ford in The Fastest Gun Alive. The man arriving on the brink of a range war in a valley is maybe most famously associated with Shane. There are a few Shane-related references throughout this movie as well. So, John Henry Clayton is an amalgam of all of these characters and many more, but Kiefer Sutherland approaches him with such subtlety and stoicism that he rises above what could become cliché. Watching him in this movie makes me wish he would do more Westerns, honestly, because he's got that squinting, man-of-few-words attitude down pat. But while the character tries hard to never betray what he's thinking, there are times it boils over and results in raw emotion. And whether it's in a more powerful scene like that, or just his quiet expressions during conversations, we get a wide range of feelings that are never overt, but definitely present. Be that an inner hurt, or pain, guilt, anger, unrequited love. Kiefer Sutherland portrays all of this brilliantly. Just a note on this character as well, he presents the idea of turning the other cheek more than maybe any other tough guy character in a Western I've seen. He endures beatings, humiliations, you name it, and you know he's going to snap at some point. It's kind of expected. But what I appreciated is that he never loses his cool because of anything done to him, but instead turns to a more aggressive response only after his father is attacked. And speaking of his father, Donald Sutherland plays the Reverend Samuel Clayton. Something of a reference to Ward Bond in The Searchers, I just realized, and he's a hard, stern man, but also one eager to reestablish a relationship with his son, even if he's not sure how to go about doing that. Right from their first scene together, you can see that he wants to correct his son, wants to make him understand how he's hurt and shamed him with his life since they last met, but at the same time doesn't want to lose him. That first scene when John Henry rides up and Reverend Clayton walks outside is played beautifully by each of them. It's a masterclass in underplaying. Speaking of which, there are several moments in this movie where the actors, and the director I'm sure, chose to go for the most understated approach. With so much said without actually voicing it, and the feelings playing out behind their eyes really gripping the audience. That moment when Donald Sutherland walks outside and you see this brief flicker of excitement and relief play out across his face, but then quickly buried, replaced with a hardened expression of disapproval. I thought it was excellent. Their dynamic is wonderful throughout the film, and I really enjoyed how you can see the characters' relationship reverting back to what it likely was years before, but now being enacted by a middle-aged man and his elderly father. I loved the moment when John Henry climbs up into the wagon for his father to drive him into town and immediately crosses his arms, looking like a grumpy teenager getting into the passenger seat of a family car. The emotional climax is probably the scene they share in the church, when John Henry admits what really brought him home finally, and it's the biggest outburst you see from him. Kiefer Sutherland really commits to the scene. I can't imagine that being easy, especially having to break down like that next to your veteran actor dad, but it's completely convincing, and Donald Sutherland reacts beautifully as this rock beside him. Demi Moore plays a woman that was John Henry's love from his younger years, but has moved on and married someone else while he was away. And while I would have never expected Demi Moore to show up in a Western, she feels real and like she belongs as this woman of the frontier. Almost all of her scenes are with Kiefer Sutherland, and the two of them play off one another really well. Like the one with his father, his first scene with her as she rides over to visit him is well acted and just well written. While she is fairly confident, despite not being sure what to say to him after all these years, the way he behaves around her is very well done. John Henry isn't quite sure how to act. You can tell he wants to look at her, but he's nervous, probably a little ashamed of how he abandoned her after promising to return after the Civil War was over. And again, all of this is shown without saying any of it. And his reaction to learning she is married and has a child is quietly heart-wrenching. Which reminds me, I appreciated so much how the movie avoids a cliche that I despise in any genre. That being the old flame returning and immediately striking up a romantic relationship with his former girlfriend, regardless if she's married or not. The fact that this movie makes a point of staying away from that was so refreshing. And it leads to the scene where her now husband confronts John Henry in the street and wants him to declare that he doesn't love her. And he doesn't. He just puts on his hat and walks away without a word. So obviously, those feelings he had for her years back have not died, but he's never going to act on them. The husband character, played by Greg Ellis, is one of the weaker aspects of the movie, mainly because he's sort of underwritten and his motivations don't always make a lot of sense. Michael Wincott, though, is amazing as Dave Turner, the hired gunfighter that has been brought in to help rid the valley of the homesteaders. He's sort of a Doc Holliday-like character with his tailored suits and vests and that smooth southern drawl, but then filtered through Michael Wincott's gravelly voice. The character is nominally a bad guy. He is working for the wrong side after all, but rather than a sadistic killer, he's a professional with a code of ethics in his work that he abides by, even if the thugs that he's surrounded with don't understand it. And once again, the scene where he and Kiefer Sutherland meet is really good. Both men are underplaying as much as possible, with Dave Turner sizing up the infamous John Henry Clayton, and John Henry just trying to calmly state that he will cause no trouble. The dialogue in that scene, as well as their scene on the porch, is so well written. That later scene on the porch is fantastic, with the two men relating their war experiences to each other from opposite sides of the war, just like the opposite sides that they stand on now. And finally, their last scene together is one of the things I remembered loving from my first viewing, and I still do. The way John Henry circumvents Dave Turner's professional code is quite entertaining. Brian Cox plays Mr. McCurdy, the film's real villain, driving out peace-loving folk to make way for the railroad. I like Brian Cox in pretty much everything I've seen him in, and I think he does do a good job here as well. But for some reason, he spews the F word in almost every scene he appears in. And I hate that in any movie, but when it shows up in an otherwise almost profanity-free film like this one, it stands out even more. So they were so close to pulling off a traditional feeling Western, and then Brian Cox shows up and wrecks that a little. So that's disappointing. And speaking of disappointments, Aaron Poole plays one of the more irritating and violent henchmen on McCurdy's payroll. He's really hamming it up most of the time and stands out from the more subdued tone of the film. As I said at the start, the movie was directed by John Cassar, a veteran of dozens of 24 episodes, so obviously he and Kiefer Sutherland have a very good rapport. Prior to this, he had just finished directing a good chunk of the limited series 24 Live Another Day, and across all of that, amongst other TV shows, he's shown that he is a great director of action, and he proves that here as well. I think you can tell that directing a Western was a once-in-a-lifetime dream of his, because he manages to fit in as much of the standard Western iconography as possible. We get a nice suiting up for battle scene, a little bit of gun twirling, fist fights and shootouts, expansive vistas with a lone rider crossing the screen, and it all feels loving and reverential for the Western genre. Speaking of the scenery, the movie was shot on location in Alberta, Canada, and you can always tell when it's a Canadian-produced Western, even if they're all set in Montana or Wyoming, as this one is, but where some go for that cold, wet look with everything being dreary and gray, the whole movie has a warm, traditional look with plenty of green hills, gold, sunset splash shots, all of which I loved. The score was by Jonathan Goldsmith, and while I think it's adequate, it doesn't have quite the Western sound I was hoping for. It's very low-key, which is fine, but I think a more orchestral sound would have suited some of the visuals better. For another Shane reference, there is an element to the story that revolves around a giant stump that John Henry is working on removing in the middle of a field, hoping his father will join him in completing the job. Shane, of course, also deals with a giant stump, both he and Van Heflin's character setting about chopping it away. The symbolism of working together towards a common goal is well used in both movies. And there is a scene that seems like it's going to turn into a Pale Rider reference, Pale Rider itself also being a takeoff on Shane, where John Henry rides to pick up a new axe handle in town, and while carrying it, witnesses a man being brutalized by the ever-present bad guys. It seems like this could turn into a repeat of Clint Eastwood's efficient dispatching of the jerks in that movie, but John Henry is still avoiding violence at that point. But when that finally crumbles, we get an excellent gunfight in the saloon, which includes some nice usage of a LeMat revolver, including its handy shotgun barrel. As you can tell, I'm a fan. There's somewhat of a visual reference to The Shootist as well, with John Henry diving over and hiding behind the bar, and overall it's a well-filmed, suspenseful shootout. The moral of the film sort of gets forgotten about, I think. John Henry's father is a minister, and in one tense scene, John Henry declares that he no longer believes in God. So it feels like the movie is heading towards a conclusion of some kind where he regains his faith if he ever had it, or discovers it for the first time. But instead, I think the movie uses his reconciliation with his father as a stand-in, which also sort of peters out. Because he does end up picking up his guns again, which I'm not complaining about, but it doesn't have quite the satisfying ending that I think these characters deserve. So as a Christian, I was hoping for a more solid resolution to the faith aspect of the story, but instead the movie settles with the more traditional movie ending, even if that doesn't wrap things up in the best way. Forsaken is a really well-made little Western that deserves to be seen. And when I say little, it's because it's a smaller story and a nice, tight 89 minutes, just like the Westerns back in the 1950s. It's by no means original, it's a story that has been told many times, but it's fleshed out by great archetypal characters and a bunch of excellent performances. It's not perfect, but for Western fans or just fans of more old-fashioned, entertaining movies, it's a great watch. Highly recommended. Thanks so much for watching my review. If you enjoyed it, please check back to my channel, Hildebrand Productions. Thanks again, and adios for now.